Hey, the stage of retirement brings a whole new set of risks to the table that we really didn't think about before. In the accumulation phase, we were probably thinking about putting enough money in, not the distribution phase, where we're probably worried more about running out of money or a health issue that's going to come up. One of the biggest risks to retirees that they're really not even aware of is what's called the sequence of return risk. You might have never even heard of the sequence of return risk. If you think about it in your accumulation years, you don't have the sequence of return risk. And that's because the order of the returns or the sequence of the returns that you get from year to year to year, it doesn't positively or negatively impact what your ending balance is when you retire. And that's really basically the commutative property of a multiplication. Doesn't matter what order you multiply numbers in, you get the same result. But when you retire, it's a different picture. It's a different set of rules. The sequence of return risk comes in at that particular point in time. So we want to take a look at an illustration that shows the sequence of return risk. So let's take a look and let's project two scenarios. So the first scenario that we've got projected here is the accumulation phase. And the accumulation phase is going to be illustrated by $500,000 in which we're not taking any distributions out of it. And you'll notice that the image basically shows kind of a left-hand side and a right-hand side. And the difference between the left-hand side and the right-hand side is the column that says yearly return. So the yearly return is in one order on the left-hand side, and it's in the reverse order on the right-hand side. So $500,000 in the first year gets a 28% return, grows to 640. In the second year, it loses 10%, and so on and so forth. But on the right-hand side, you'll notice that the sequence of returns is different. It's actually just flip-flopped in terms of order. The first return of 28% ends up being the last return on the right-hand side. So just flip-flopped. So what is the point about the ending balance related to being in the accumulation phase of life? Well, let's look at the ending balance between each side, left side and right side. $5,127,559. What is it on the right-hand side? $5,127,559. It's identical. It's a duplicate. Even though the order of the returns was different, in other words, it was the inverse on one side versus the other, didn't matter. Ultimately, the ending balance was the same. It didn't matter the order or the sequence of the returns that you ended up getting. But let's look at the alternative to this, which is the distribution phase. We're just going to add a column to each side, and that column on each side is a withdrawal column. So the only difference between what you saw previously and what you're seeing in this particular scenario is we're adding a 5% withdrawal to each year. Let's look at the results. Once again, yearly return is in a particular order, and then on the right-hand side, the yearly return is inverted. And it's inverted in the sense that you'll see that the right-hand side has more negative returns in the earlier years, whereas those negative returns on the left-hand side end up being in the later years of retirement. What is the actual impact or the result of the value over time? Well, on the left-hand side, with positive returns in the initial stages of retirement and a 5% withdrawal, $500,000 still grows to well over $3 million, even though I'm taking a 5% distribution, and that distribution is even growing every single year with inflation. What if I invert the returns here on the right-hand side and end up taking 5%, but if I end up with negative returns in the earlier years, what is happening to my balance over the years? I actually run out of money in the 19th year of retirement versus having over $3 million at the end of retirement. That's a huge difference. So why is there this dramatic difference? Well, obviously, the difference between the first graph and the second graph includes the fact that we're taking distributions, but it's not that we're taking distributions alone. We saw that the left-hand side that had a positive sequence of returns still worked well, even though there were distributions. But what the big difference is whether or not there are negative returns that are occurring early on in retirement. What happens when that occurs? If I systematically need to take out the same amount of money month after month after month, and I end up going into a downward trend in terms of my investments or the market, what ends up happening is I end up having to sell more shares of my investments in order to get the same amount of money each month. Ultimately, as the markets continues to decline, I'm selling more and more and more and more and more shares than I would have in another case. So that when later on there is a recovery, the market recovers, there are fewer shares, I own fewer shares that are able to actually benefit from the recovery. Well, that's completely different than the accumulation phase of life. In the accumulation phase, I'm not selling shares at all. I'm buying shares. And if I'm contributing money and I'm buying shares, I'm probably buying more and more and more of them. And during a bad market time, I'm buying even more of them because they're on special. They're discounted. So during the accumulation phase of life, I don't have the sequence of return risk. I actually am able to benefit during that bad time by buying more and more and more shares. But during the distribution phase of life in retirement, during that down market time period, I'm selling more shares than I thought I would need to. And ultimately, the recovery isn't able to benefit all of those shares. So it's not something that's really common knowledge going into retirement. What is the sequence of return risk? It's not like there's some retirement school that we go to. We're able to learn about these things. So we've got this risk, sequence of return risk, and one of the challenges of money management in retirement is how do we allocate our money, manage the money of the portfolio and the risk in such a way as to mitigate or to reduce this kind of stock market risk and this sequence of return risk that we're actually experiencing. And so in future videos, we will take a look at common ways and strategic ways to reduce that sequence